First Lieutenant John Justice scans the hellish sky around him, frantically searching for his teammates among the flock of Messerschmitts tearing into the formation of 13 American bombers bound for the German town of Münster. The Luftwaffe fighters take out the bombers one by one. As the group leader's plane is hit and plummets, Justice dives to join a nearby Allied formation, only to feel the jarring impact of a 20mm shell tearing through his aircraft. The bomber begins an aggressive descent. Then another hit. Flames consume the wings, and the cockpit buckles under the strain. Justice knows the end is near. Years with the 100th Bomb Group have taught him to recognize when tragedy is near. Justice remembers, quote, "I put on my chute and went toward the bomb bay." He leaps into the freezing air, hurtling toward the earth as the battle above him ensues. At just 500 feet, his parachute snaps open, halting his fall just in time. As he lands in enemy territory and looks up at the sky, the rest of his squadron is gone. There's no one coming to his rescue, and the German troops are fast approaching. But Justice refuses to let the unit's curse claim him too. Unfit to fly. In February 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force arrived in England, ready to take to the European skies to defeat Hitler. Standing before the British royal family, General Ira Eaker, the 8th Air Force's first commander, spoke with unwavering resolve, quote, "We hope when we leave, you will be glad we came." As Eaker uttered these words, back in America, the race was on to assemble and train dozens of Air Force units, molding raw recruits into an airborne force capable of fighting against the Nazis. Among these formations was the 100th Bombardment Group. Its first commander, Colonel Dar H. Alkire, made it clear from day one how things would go down for the cadets, stating with a firm tone, quote, "Don't get the notion that your job is going to be glorious or glamorous. You've got dirty work to do." The men of the 100th wasted no time getting airborne. Planes immediately launched into rigorous training missions, preparing to face the Luftwaffe. But cracks in their ranks were soon evident. The would-be pilots struggled with the fundamentals: precision bombing, formation flying, and navigation in the skies. In April 1943, commanders set a test to prove their trainees, a long-range navigation exercise, flying 1,300 miles from Nebraska to California. Simple enough, or so they thought. What should have been a confirmation of the unit's readiness turned into an embarrassment for the American Air Force. Planes scattered across the western United States. 3 crews landed in Las Vegas, while another inexplicably touched down in Tennessee, where the pilot's wife conveniently resided. The incident made a mockery of their training program and cost Colonel Alkire his command. Despite leadership replacements, the group seemed doomed to fail. Chaos remained the norm for the 100th. Training schedules were disorganized and discipline was lax. Fistfights broke out between airmen, with some officers dismissing the brawls as necessary to release the psychological strain of preparing for war. The men, unchecked and unpolished, admitted later, quote, "We were all conceited and quite impossible. We were undertrained and not as good as we thought we were." Still, there was no time for concessions. While the 100th struggled to find its footing, Nazi forces marched across Europe, fortifying their strongholds and closing in on the Allies. The call came in May 1943. The 100th Bomb Group was ordered to deploy to the United Kingdom, ready or not. As the fleet made its way across the Atlantic, they carried with them the weight of General Eaker's promise to the British people, a promise which was about to be put to the test. Baptism by fire. Once in England, the air and ground crews of the 100th Bomb Group reunited at RAF Thorpe Abbotts, an airfield in Norfolk, about 107 miles from London, which would become the unit's home base. Just weeks after touching down, on June 25, 1943, the group was thrust into the 8th Air Force's bombing campaign against German soil. Their target was the U-boat yards in Bremen, an industrial hub supplying Hitler's war machine. The crews didn't hesitate to take to the skies, but their courage didn't compensate for their lack of expertise. As their bombers crossed into hostile territory, fire erupted from all sides, rattling their airframes with concussive blasts that made planes shake to their core. Then, out of the clouds came the Luftwaffe. German fighters dove from above. The air was suddenly filled with enemy shells, tracers streaking past cockpits and explosions blooming in the distance. The men of the 100th, unprepared for the assault, fought to hold formation. But the Luftwaffe had the upper hand. Their bullets found the bombers, shattering windows and sending planes spiraling toward the ground. From their cockpits, the surviving air crews could only watch in horror as 3 B-17s, carrying 30 of their comrades, came crashing down. As the survivors made their way back to Thorpe Abbotts, they began to grapple with the realization they had underestimated the brutal reality of war. In the weeks that followed, the 100th flew more missions against industrial targets and airfields deep in Nazi territory. Each sortie grew more harrowing than the last. The bombers that returned were barely airworthy, their crews bloodied and shaken. Many never made it back at all. Their missions seemed cursed, and before the summer was over, the 100th Bomb Group had earned a rough nickname, the Bloody 100th. The name spread through the ranks of the 8th Air Force and beyond. New recruits assigned to the unit began to see their posting as a sentence. It was said that one young airman, upon receiving his orders, broke down in tears, saying, quote, "I'm not going to make it. They just put me in the 100th group. I haven't got a chance." A shift in the wind. Despite heavy losses, the pilots of the 100th Bomb Group refused to be grounded. In late 1943, the unit got a chance to redeem themselves with a mission to strike U-boat pens in Nazi-occupied Norway. This mission would take the 100th on a 1,900-mile round trip, most of it across the unforgiving expanse of the North Sea, where treacherous winds and icy waters lay in wait alongside German fighters. Frost crept over the bombers' windows as they pressed deeper into hostile territory, scanning for German interceptors. After 12 hours of flying, the U-boat pens finally came into view. One by one, the bombers opened their payload bays, and a rain of bombs cascaded down, their destructive force slamming right onto their target. The crews watched, almost in disbelief, as the submarine pens were consumed by fire. For the first time, the 100th Bomb Group felt the rush of victory. As the pens below burned, the formation turned for home. During the journey back, First Lieutenant Harry Crosby, the group's lead navigator, faced a crisis. A storm rolled in, obscuring the planned route back to England. With visibility dropping to minimal levels and the formation scattered, Crosby had to act quickly. Ignoring protocol, he plotted a new course and gave orders over the radio for all 63 planes to follow him. But in his haste, the young navigator forgot to relay his position back to base, a serious breach of procedure that could have ended his career. For hours, the bombers were effectively off the map, their fate unknown to those waiting at Thorpe Abbotts. The tension on board was palpable as they flew through turbulent skies. Crosby's improvised route their only hope to come back to home base alive. Finally, as dawn broke, the bombers began to emerge from the clouds over England. Crosby braced for a reprimand upon landing, certain that his decision to deviate from orders and his failure to radio in would lead to disciplinary action. Instead, he was met with praise. By flying a silent, uncharted path, Crosby had not only brought the group safely home, but also avoided detection by trailing German forces, preventing a costly interception. His technical error and quick wit ended up winning him the Distinguished Flying Cross. For a brief moment, it seemed the 100th Bomb Group's curse was beginning to lift. The cost of victory. By mid-August 1943, the 100th Bomb Group was preparing for one of its most dangerous missions yet. On the 17th, the unit was tasked with striking the Messerschmitt aircraft factory in Regensburg. Unlike previous raids, the bombers would not return to England. Instead, they were to press southward to airfields in North Africa, refuel, and regroup, taking them on a 1,200-mile journey over heavily defended enemy territory. As dawn broke on mission day, the B-17 Flying Fortresses took off at RAF Thorpe Abbotts. The 100th Bomb Group was assigned the dreaded tail-end Charlie position, the most exposed spot in the formation, where attacks from enemy fighters were most lethal and backup from other squadrons was nearly impossible. The moment the bombers crossed into enemy airspace, the skies turned red with enemy fire. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs descended upon the formation. Strikes from anti-aircraft burst around the pilots, rocking the planes and sending pieces of metal flying down. Smoke trailed from damaged engines, and yet the group refused to retreat. When the Messerschmitt factory finally came within reach, the bomb bays opened, and payloads came crashing over the targets. However, victory didn't taste as sweet this time. By the time the 100th exited German airspace, 9 of their 22 planes were lost, each carrying a crew of 10 brave men. For the survivors, there was no time to grieve. They still had hundreds of miles to go before they could land. Hours later, the bombers touched down on the dusty runways of North Africa, their crews exhausted but relieved to be alive. As mechanics swarmed around to repair the damaged planes, First Lieutenant Owen Roan recruited a peculiar new addition to the group's ranks, a tiny African donkey, which he named Mohammed. As the bombers took off for England, Mohammed found himself smuggled aboard Roan's B-17, wrapped in blankets to protect him from the freezing temperatures at high altitude. As the unit approached its home base, Roan announced over the radio, quote, "I'm coming in with a frozen ass." Ground crews rushed to meet the plane, expecting frostbitten crew members, only to be greeted by the sight of the shivering donkey being carefully unloaded. The Monster Raid. Just 2 months after the tragedy over Regensburg, the Bloody Hundredth embarked on a mission to raid Münster, a German stronghold that controlled industrial and rail connections. Their objective seemed straightforward: strike at Münster's choke points and return home. 13 B-17 bombers took to the skies that day. As they neared the target, the Luftwaffe intercepted them. Fierce flak fire erupted around the bombers, with waves of enemy aircraft chewing through the formations. One by one, the flying fortresses were taken down, until only a single bomber remained airborne. Among the bombers shot down was Pasadena Nina, piloted by First Lieutenant John K. Justice. The aircraft sustained a direct hit from a 20mm shell, crippling one of its engines and sending it into a violent spin. Justice and his co-pilot fought to regain control, finally leveling the plane just above the treetops. With their aircraft severely damaged and defenseless, they attempted to escape the clutches of the Luftwaffe. But the enemy pressed on, riddling the bomber with more cannon fire. Justice and the crew had no choice but to bail out, parachuting into the dense forests below. Alone in enemy territory, Justice was forced to remain hidden from German patrols scouring the area. He navigated the forest in silence, heart pounding with each distant shout or snapped twig. Exhausted and wary, he eventually encountered Dutch locals who risked everything to help him. The resistance took Justice under its wing, moving him from one safe house to another through barns, attics, and haystacks. Each hiding spot came with the constant threat of discovery, but the Dutch people never wavered. Justice later recalled their extraordinary sacrifice, quote, "Food was not plentiful, and most was rationed, yet they shared their meager goods with us, who represented their hope for liberation." Weeks passed as Justice evaded capture, relying on the courage of the Dutch resistance. The shadow of the Gestapo loomed ever-present, but Justice pressed on. Guided through treacherous terrain and hostile towns, he eventually crossed into Spain, where he was handed over to British officials. On Christmas Day, 1943, after months of evasion, Justice was finally flown back to England. The last days. A year later, on New Year's Eve 1944, Bloody Hundredth faced one of its final cursed battles of the war. They were deployed to a raid on Hamburg, set to eradicate oil refineries amid dense winter clouds. By this point, many of the 100th Bomb Group's veterans were physically and emotionally drained. The so-called curse of the Bloody Hundredth hung heavy over them after years of painful losses. Yet, even with danger permanently waiting for them, they carried out their orders. During the mission, enemy fire wasn't the only force sending pilots flying down. Mechanical failures added to the danger, leaving some aircraft hovering dangerously low. The fear of being stranded deep in enemy territory haunted every crew member, with many recalling the harrowing escape of John K. Justice just months earlier. Still, the 100th would not give up easily. The bombers released their payloads over Hamburg, hitting their target and finding their way back to Thorpe Abbotts. Yet the new year would begin on a somber note, with the pilots being faced with the loss of their own once more. As the war drew to a close, the 100th Bomb Group repurposed their B-17 flying fortresses for mercy missions. Flying at low altitudes, the crews risked their lives to drop food supplies to the starving Dutch population, who waved and cheered from below. By the end of their service, the 100th Bomb Group had flown over 8,000 missions across some of the most dangerous skies in Europe. They paid a staggering price. Over 700 airmen were lost, and 177 aircraft destroyed. The group fulfilled the promise General Ira Eaker had made years earlier to the British royal family and the people of England. The 100th proved themselves time and again, defying danger, loss, and the ever-present specter of their so-called curse, making the British people and the folks back home proud of their unlikely triumph during one of the darkest chapters the world has ever faced.